The coffee hit the old man in the chest, and the marble lobby went silent. I said, "Fetch." The CEO snapped, already walking, not even looking back at the figure he'd just doused. A quiet Latino man in his 60s, in a plain gray work jacket, standing very still while hot coffee ran down his shirt. And clean that up. God, they'll let anyone loiter in here. Brandon Reeve did not slow down. He was late, he was important, and the man he had just thrown his coffee at was, as far as Brandon could tell, nobody. Maintenance man. A loiterer. The kind of person who exists at the edges of a lobby like this to be sent for things and told to clean up messes. Brandon Reeve had built his entire career on knowing, at a glance, exactly who mattered and who did not. And this old man in the cheap jacket did not matter. The old man bent down, slowly, and picked up the fallen cup. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his eyes. He simply cleaned the marble with a handkerchief from his own pocket, and he watched the CEO disappear into the executive elevator. And something moved behind his quiet face that Brandon Reeve, had he bothered to look, would have found very frightening, because the old man in the gray jacket was Nestor Salazar. And Nestor Salazar had built this building, and the company inside it, and the empire above it. From a produce truck 40 years ago, he owned the controlling share of every floor Brandon Reeve strutted across. And that professional signature at the bottom of Brandon Reeve's 8-figure compensation package, the one that made the CEO feel so important, had been authorized, every single year, by the quiet man now wiping coffee off the marble floor of his own lobby. Brandon Reeve had just thrown his coffee at the man who signed his paychecks, and in about 2 weeks, at a gala in front of 500 people, he was going to find out. How does a billionaire end up cleaning a CEO's coffee off his own floor? You have to go back to a produce truck, a young man with nothing, and a lesson about people that took 40 years and one thrown cup of coffee to finally come full circle. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever been treated like you were invisible by someone who had no idea who you really are, stay with me. This one is for you. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs to men who have already won everything and have nothing left to prove, and Nestor Salazar had it. At 61, he could have been sitting on a yacht in the Mediterranean, or a stage collecting an award or a magazine cover, the way other men of his wealth arranged their lives. Instead, most mornings, he could be found doing something that made his security team quietly insane, walking through the lobby of one of his own office towers, in a plain gray work jacket and scuffed shoes. Unrecognized, unremarked, invisible. Just an old man moving through a building, watching, listening, feeling the pulse of the thing he had built with his own 2 hands, from nothing, a long time ago. He did it because it was the only way left to see the truth. When you are Nestor Salazar, founder, chairman, controlling owner of Salazar Global, one of the largest privately held companies in the country, everyone you meet performs for you. They straighten their posture and manage their faces and tell you what they think you want to hear, because you are the man who signs everything, and no one shows their real self to the man who signs everything. So Nestor had learned, over the years, to take the jacket off, to become no one. Because it is only when people think you are no one that they show you who they actually are. And Nestor Salazar had built his entire life and his entire fortune on one unshakable belief that you learn everything about a man by how he treats someone who can't do anything for him. His own father had taught him that, a long time ago and a long way from here, in a language they had left a country speaking. His father had been a man who had nothing and gave respect to everyone, from the banker who denied him a loan to the child who swept his little shop, and young Nestor had watched and learned and carried the lesson across a border and into a new life, where it had made him not just rich but the specific kind of rich that other rich men found unsettling, because Nestor Salazar treated the man who parked his car exactly the way he treated the man who ran his bank, and in a world built on the careful calibration of contempt, that made him a kind of quiet revolution. To understand the man wiping coffee off the marble, you have to go back 40 years, to a young Nestor with a borrowed truck and a debt he could not afford, and a dream everyone around him found faintly ridiculous. He had come to this country with nothing but his father's lesson and a back strong enough to carry produce. He started by selling fruit and vegetables off that truck in neighborhoods the big grocers ignored, and he was, from the very first day, treated by the world exactly the way Brandon Reeve had just treated him in the lobby, as a nobody, an accent, a man you send for things and do not see. Bankers waved him off. Cocliers cheated him, assuming the immigrant with the truck couldn't read a contract. Landlords sneered, and Nestor Salazar, young and proud and burning, made a decision in those years that would define the rest of his life. He would remember every single one of them. Not to take revenge. He had no time for revenge. Revenge is a luxury of people who have already eaten. He would remember them so that when he became powerful, and some fierce, quiet certainty in him always knew he would never, ever become one of them. And he became powerful. God, did he become powerful. The truck became a stand, and the stand became a store, and the store became a chain. Because Nestor Salazar understood something the sneering bankers never did, that the neighborhoods they ignored were full of people with money and pride, and nowhere that treated them with respect. And that respect, it turns out, is the most profitable product in the world. He built a company on it. He hired the people no one else would hire, the immigrants, the ex-cons trying to come back, the single mothers, the men with accents and the women with no degrees. And he treated every one of them like his father had treated the child who swept the shop, and they gave him a loyalty that no MBA could model and no competitor could buy. Salazar Global grew into distribution, into real estate, into logistics, into an empire, and through all of it, for 40 years, Nestor kept the culture his father's lesson had built. You take care of the people who take care of the work, and you never, ever mistake a man's uniform for his worth. Let me give you one scene from those years, because it explains the whole man. When Salazar Global was still just a growing chain of neighborhood stores, a large national grocer tried to crush it the way big companies crush small ones, undercutting prices, leaning on suppliers, the whole quiet violence of capital against the upstart. Nestor should have lost. He had no money to fight a giant. But the giant made the mistake that giants always make, the same one Brandon Reeve would make decades later. It did not understand that Nestor's real asset was not on any balance sheet. His workers, the ones no one else would hire, whom he had treated like family. They found out their company was under attack, and they did not need to be asked. They worked doubles for the same pay. Suppliers who had been treated with respect by the immigrant with the truck, when everyone else looked down on them, quietly gave Nestor better terms than they gave the giant, out of a loyalty that had been earned, one handshake at a time, over 10 years. The neighborhoods that Nestor's stores actually served, the ones the giant had ignored for decades, closed ranks around him. And the giant, baffled, watched a company it should have been able to destroy simply refuse to die, held up by 10,000 small loyalties it could not see and could not buy. And eventually it gave up and went away. Nestor learned, in that fight, the lesson that would make him a billionaire, and that Brandon Reeve would never in his life understand. That respect is not sentiment. Respect is infrastructure. It is the strongest and cheapest structural material in the world, and the men who sneer at it as softness are the men who have never watched it save them. There was a boy in those years, a teenager named Diego. Funny that, Nestor would think later, a boy named Diego, who Nestor caught trying to steal from one of his stores. Everyone told Nestor to call the police. Instead, Nestor sat the terrified kid down, learned that he was stealing to feed a younger sister, and gave him a job stocking shelves after school. That boy grew up to run Salazar Global's entire logistics operation, and he named his own son Nestor, and he was one of the 10,000 reasons the giant could not kill the company. That was who Nestor Salazar was. That was the machine of loyalty and dignity and second chances that he built, one person at a time, over 40 years. And that was precisely the machine that Brandon Reeve, decades later, would look at and see only as a cost to be cut. Then, 6 years before the morning of the coffee, Nestor Salazar's wife died. Elena had been with him since the truck. She had ridden in the passenger seat on the first cold mornings, had counted the first crumpled dollars, had believed in him when the whole world found him ridiculous, and she had been, for 40 years, the other half of everything he built. When she was gone, something in Nestor went quiet in a way that never fully came back. He lost his appetite for the stage, the covers, the performance of being a titan. He stepped back from the daily running of the company. He was tired and grieving, and the empire was vast, and he did what wealthy grieving founders are advised to do. He brought in professional management, a polished, credentialed, expensive CEO to run the day-to-day, while Nestor retained his controlling ownership and his chairman's seat, and, crucially, his final signature on everything that mattered. He would own it. He would guard its soul from a distance, but he would let someone else carry the weight, because he no longer had the heart to carry it alone. The someone else was Brandon Reeve. Brandon Reeve was 44, and he was, on paper, exactly what the consultant said the company needed. The right school, the right firms, the right jaw, the right vocabulary of synergies and efficiencies and shareholder value. He interviewed brilliantly. He said all the right things about honoring the founder's legacy, about people-first culture, about the Salazar way. And Nestor, grieving and tired and wanting to believe, had signed off on him. It was, Nestor would later admit to himself, the worst decision of his life. And he had made it, because grief makes even wise men careless. And because Brandon Reeve was very, very good at telling powerful people what they wanted to hear. It is a specific talent, that one. It is the talent of a certain kind of predator. Because the moment the founders stepped back into the shadows, Brandon Reeve began, quietly and then not quietly, to gut everything Nestor Salazar had spent 40 years building. Not the profits looked fine, better than fine, which is exactly how these things stay hidden. Brandon gutted the soul. He looked at the loyal old workforce, the immigrants and the ex-cons and the single mothers, the people who had given Nestor 40 years of their lives, and he saw not loyalty, but inefficiency. He saw legacy costs. He began, methodically, to push them out. The older workers first, the ones near their pensions, the ones whose loyalty had a price tag Brandon resented paying. He replaced a culture of respect with a culture of fear, because fear is cheaper than respect, and Brandon had never in his life understood the difference. And he did it all wrapped in the language of modernization, so that from the distance where a grieving founder watched, it could almost look like progress. Almost. But Nestor Salazar had not built an empire by being fooled by language. And so, slowly, as his grief began to lift enough for him to see again, Nestor started to put the gray jacket back on. He started to walk his own buildings again. And what he found there, in the fear on the faces of people who used to smile, in the empty desks where 40-year veterans used to sit, in the way the new employees flinched when a manager walked by, broke something in him and, at the same time, woke something up. The company he had built to be a home had been turned, in his absence, into a machine that chewed people up. And the man doing the chewing had no idea that the quiet founder was watching. Let me tell you about the weeks before the coffee, because they matter, because Nestor did not act on the first thing he saw, or the second. He was a careful man, and a fair one, and he wanted to be certain. So he walked, and he watched, and he did something Brandon Reeve would never in 1,000 years have thought to do. He talked to the invisible people. The security guards, the cleaning crew, the loading dock workers, the people Brandon swept past without seeing, the people who see everything precisely because no one thinks they're worth performing for. And they told the quiet old man in the gray jacket, not knowing who he was, the truth of what the company had become. They told him about Maria, 40 years on the loading dock, pushed out 3 months before her pension vested, on a technicality Brandon's people had manufactured. Nestor went to see her. He did not tell her who he was. He came as the old man in the gray jacket, saying he was a retired worker who had heard her story and wanted to pay his respects. And Maria, who had a kind heart even after what had been done to her, invited the stranger in for coffee in a small apartment where the walls were covered in 40 years of a life given to a company. She showed him the plaque she'd been given at year 25, signed by the founder himself. back when the founder still signed such things by hand. He knew me, Mr. Salazar did, she said, not knowing she was saying it to him. He came down to the dock once a year, every year, shook every hand. Knew my Ramon's name. Knew when my grandbabies were born. She touched the plaque. This new one, he had me walked out by security like I stole something. 40 years, and I got a cardboard box and a man in a suit, watching to make sure I didn't take a stapler. She wasn't bitter when she said it. She was worse than bitter. She was resigned, the way people get when the world has taught them that dignity is a thing that belongs to other people. And Nestor Salazar sat in that small apartment and drank the coffee of a woman his company had thrown away, and looked at his own signature on a plaque on her wall from a better version of himself, and he made her a silent promise that he would keep 2 weeks later on a gala stage. Before he left, she pressed a foil packet of pan dolce into his hands. For the road, because she had almost nothing and still gave to a stranger, and Nestor had to sit in his car for a while before he could drive. They told him about the Christmas bonus that had quietly vanished, the one Nestor had personally instituted in the truck days and had never once missed in 40 years, canceled by Brandon as a non-strategic expense. They told him about the fear, how you didn't speak up anymore, how you kept your head down, how the place that used to feel like a family now felt like a place you were lucky to still be tolerated in. And they told him, most of all, about how Brandon Reeve treated the people beneath him. The screaming, the contempt, the specific cruelty of a man who had learned that in this new version of the company, cruelty to the powerless carried no cost at all. One of them, an old security guard named Walter who had worked the lobby for 30 years, said something to Nestor that Nestor would carry into everything that came after. Walter didn't recognize the founder. Nestor had hired him 30 years ago, but they had both been younger men, and grief and time change a face, and so Walter spoke freely, the way you speak to a stranger who seems kind. You know what the worst part is? Walter said, over a coffee in the loading dock break room. Mr. Salazar built this place to be different. I was here. He knew my name. He knew my kids' names. And this new fella? Walter shook his head. He looked right through me for 2 years. 2 years, and he's never once said good morning. I don't think he knows I'm a person. I think he thinks the lobby comes with a guard, the way it comes with a door. Walter laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. Old man Salazar would never have stood for it. But he's gone quiet since his wife passed. God rest her. I don't think he knows what they're doing to his house. Nestor Salazar drove home that night and sat in the dark for a long time. And he grieved, for Elena and for Walter, and for Maria on the loading dock, and for the 40 years of his life that a polished stranger was quietly dismantling. And then he stopped grieving, and he started planning, because Nestor Salazar had not clawed his way out of a produce truck by mourning what was being taken from him. He decided he would give Brandon Reeve exactly enough rope. He would watch, up close, unrecognized, and he would let Brandon show him, with his own hands, exactly who he was. And then Nestor would do what his father had taught him a powerful man must sometimes do. He would remind everyone, in a way no one would ever forget, that the measure of a person is how they treat the man who can't do anything for them. He did not have to wait long. He did not, it turned out, even have to engineer it, because on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Nestor Salazar was standing in the lobby of his own building in his gray jacket, quietly watching the morning rush, when Brandon Reeve came through the revolving doors late and stressed and holding a coffee, and saw an old nobody standing in his way. You already know what happened. The world had done it to Nestor 10,000 times when he was young, and he had built an empire partly so that it would never happen to him again. And here it was, happening again, at 61, in the lobby of the tower he owned. Brandon didn't even break stride. He thrust the coffee at Nestor as though the old man were a receptacle, and when Nestor didn't move fast enough to take it, Brandon, irritated, sloshed it against him and snapped the word, "Fetch." And then, clean that up, and then he was gone, into the executive elevator, on his way up to run a company he thought was his, having just doused its owner in coffee and called him a loiterer. And Nestor Salazar bent down and picked up the cup and cleaned the marble, and felt, running through his quiet grief, something almost like gratitude, because Brandon Reeve had just answered, completely and finally, the only question that mattered. Nestor had wondered, in his fairer moments, whether he was being too harsh, whether the man deserved a warning, a conversation, a chance. He did not wonder anymore. A man who will throw his coffee at an old stranger and call him a loiterer, when he thinks no one who matters is watching, is a man who has shown you his soul. There was nothing left to decide. There was only the how and the when. But here is the part of the story that Nestor loved most. The part he would tell for years afterward, because it is the part that makes the whole thing more than just a rich man's revenge. As Nestor knelt there wiping coffee off the marble, a young woman stopped. A junior employee, new, maybe 24, on her way to a job she was probably terrified of losing in Brandon's culture of fear. She saw an old man in a gray jacket on his knees cleaning up someone else's mess, and she did not walk past. She crouched down next to him, and she took napkins out of her own bag, and she started to help, and she said, quietly, so as not to embarrass him, "Here, let me. Are you okay? I saw what he did. That wasn't right. You didn't deserve that." Her name, Nestor would learn, was Carmen. She was 3 months into her first real job, and she had no idea, none, that she had just crouched down on a marble floor to comfort the man who owned the entire building, at the exact moment he was deciding the future of everyone in it. She only knew that an old man had been treated cruelly, and that she could not, would not, walk past it. She could do nothing for him. She thought he was no one, and she helped him anyway. Nestor looked at this young woman helping him clean up his own lobby, and his eyes stung, and he understood that in the space of 90 seconds, on the same square of marble, the two poles of his entire philosophy had just revealed themselves. Brandon Reeve, who had everything to gain from being kind to power and had been cruel to a nobody, and Carmen, who had everything to lose and had been kind to a nobody anyway. You learn everything about a man by how he treats someone who can't do anything for him. His father's lesson, 40 years old, playing out on his own floor in a single morning. "Thank you, Misha," he said softly to Carmen. "You're a good person. Don't let this place take that from you." And she smiled, not understanding, and went to her desk, and Nestor Salazar stood up and put the coffee-stained cup in his pocket like a piece of evidence, and went to make some calls. What Nestor did over the next 2 weeks, he did quietly, the way he did everything. He did not storm in. He did not fire Brandon in a rage, which would have been satisfying and stupid, because a cornered predator lawyers up, and a company run on fear does not heal from a single dramatic firing. Instead, Nestor Salazar did what a man who owns everything and has 40 years of wisdom does. He built the case. He pulled the records, quietly, as the chairman with final authority, which meant no one could refuse him, and, because Brandon didn't know the founder was paying attention, no one thought to warn him. And what Nestor found in those records was worse than even the loading dock had known, because Brandon Reeve's cruelty was not just a personality, it was a strategy, and the strategy was theft. Nestor found that Brandon had been quietly positioning the company for a sale that would trigger an enormous personal payout for Brandon and his hand-picked lieutenants, and that would, in the process, dismantle the company Nestor had built, break it into pieces, and put thousands of the loyal people Nestor loved out of work. Brandon had been gutting the culture, not out of mere callousness, but because a company with no loyalty and no legacy costs, and no soul is easier to carve up and sell. He had been fattening a calf for slaughter, and the calf was Nestor Salazar's life's work, and the people being led to the killing floor were Walter and Maria and Carmen and 40,000 others who had trusted the name on the building. And Brandon had done all of it under the nose of a grieving founder he had assumed, correctly, would not be paying attention, right up until the founder put a gray jacket back on and started to watch. He was not alone in seeing it, as it turned out. He had one ally inside, though he had to find her. Her name was Joan Whitaker, the company's longtime chief financial officer, one of the few senior people who predated Brandon, and she had watched the sale being assembled with a growing horror she was too frightened to voice. Brandon had been careful to route the most damning pieces around her, but a good CFO sees the shape of a thing even through the gaps, and Joan had known, for months, that something was deeply wrong, and had said nothing because she had a mortgage, and 2 kids in college, and a CEO who fired people for less than curiosity. When the quiet chairman she'd assumed had checked out entirely called her, personally, and asked her, as the owner, with the authority no one could refuse, to walk him through everything, Joan Whitaker did something she would be proud of for the rest of her life. She stopped being afraid. She laid it all out, the shell entities Brandon had set up. The way the layoffs and the culture gutting had been engineered specifically to strip the company of the soft liabilities that made it hard to sell for parts. The buyers already circling. The timeline, the sale, was closer than even Nestor had feared. Weeks away, time to close right after the gala, so that Brandon could use the anniversary as a triumphant farewell before the news broke. "I should have come to you months ago," Joan told him, her voice shaking. "I was a coward." And Nestor Salazar, who understood fear better than most, because he had built a company specifically so that his people would never have to feel it, told her the truth. "You are not a coward, Joan. You are a person who was put in an impossible position by a man who made fear his business model. That is not your failure, it is his crime, and you just ended it. Thank you." With Joan's records, the abstraction became a case, airtight and signed, and Nestor had everything he needed. He had, in fact, more than he needed. He had enough to have Brandon quietly arrested. But quiet, Nestor had decided, was not the point. The point was the message. It was, Nestor reflected, an almost perfect crime. The kind of thing that happens in companies all over the world, every day, when the person who built something steps back and hands it to someone who only knows how to extract. Brandon would have gotten away with it. In a slightly different story, the story that plays out far more often than the satisfying one, Brandon Reeves sells the company, collects his fortune, moves on to gut the next one, and the workers are a line item in a press release about streamlining. That is the real world, and Nestor knew it, and it was precisely because he knew it that he decided the response could not be quiet. It had to be a message. It had to be a story that every Brandon Reeve in every boardroom in the country would hear and remember. Because Nestor Salazar was not just going to save his company. He was going to make an example that would outlive him. The occasion arranged itself. In 2 weeks, Salazar Global was to hold its 40th anniversary gala. A grand event, 500 people, the whole leadership, the board, the press. A celebration of 4 decades that Brandon Reeve intended to use as a showcase for himself, a coronation before the sale he thought no one knew about. Brandon had planned every detail of his own moment. He would give the keynote. He would stand on the stage where the company's history was celebrated and position himself as its future. There was only one small item on the program that Brandon had not been able to control. One line that the event planners had insisted on, and that Brandon had assumed was a formality, a brief appearance, near the end, by the reclusive founder and chairman, Nestor Salazar, who had not been seen in public since his wife's death, and whom half the room, including Brandon, had never actually met in person. Brandon Reeve did not know what the founder looked like. Let that sink in, because it is the whole hinge of the night. He had been the CEO for 6 years. He had run the company, spent the founder's money, dismantled the founder's legacy, and collected the compensation the founder personally authorized, and he had never once bothered to learn the man's face, because Nestor had gone reclusive and Brandon had never imagined he would need to know. To Brandon, Nestor Salazar was a signature and a controlling share, an abstraction, a ghost. He had no idea that he had thrown his coffee at that ghost 2 weeks earlier in the lobby. You can see it coming now. Nestor could too, and he savored it the way a patient man savors the thing he has waited for. The night of the gala arrived. 500 people in a grand ballroom. The history of the company projected on great screens. The produce truck to the empire. 40 years of a name that had meant something. Brandon Reeve gave his keynote, polished and hollow, all synergies and futures, receiving the applause he believed he had earned. And then the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone and said the words that would end Brandon Reeves' world. And now, please welcome, for the first time in 6 years, the man who started it all, our founder and chairman, Nestor Salazar. And a quiet old man in a simple dark suit walked out from the wings and up to the podium, and Brandon Reeve, seated in the place of honor at the front, felt the blood drain out of his face, because he knew that face. He had seen it 2 weeks ago, wet with his own coffee, on its knees on the marble of the lobby. The loiterer, the nobody, the maintenance man he had told to fetch. That man was now standing at the podium of the 40th anniversary gala, and 500 people were rising to their feet in an ovation. And the master of ceremonies had just called him the founder, the chairman, the owner of everything. And Brandon Reeve understood, in one long, freezing, perfect moment, exactly what he had done. Nestor Salazar let the ovation settle. He looked out over the 500 faces, and he found, in the crowd, the ones that mattered. Walter, the security guard, invited personally, in a borrowed suit, baffled to be there. Maria from the loading dock, brought back for the night, her pension quietly and fully restored that very afternoon by the founder's signature. And Carmen, the young woman who had crouched to help a stranger, seated near the front, having no idea why the reclusive founder's office had requested her specifically by name. Nestor found each of them, and then he found Brandon Reeve, frozen and gray in the seat of honor, and he began to speak. He did not shout. Nestor Salazar had never needed to shout. 40 years ago, he said, I sold fruit off a truck, and the world treated me like I was no one. Bankers, landlords, suppliers. To them, I was an accent and a pair of hands. And I made myself a promise, in those years, that if I ever built anything, I would build a place where no one was ever treated like I was treated, where the man who parks the car and the man who runs the bank get the same good morning, where you are measured not by what you can do for the powerful, but by how you treat the person who can do nothing for you. He paused. For 40 years, this was that place. My Elena and I built it to be that place. His voice caught, just slightly, on her name, and the room held its breath. And then I lost her, and I grew tired, and I stepped back, and I handed my house to a man I trusted to guard it. He let the silence stretch. Every person in that room now understood that something enormous was happening, though only one of them, frozen in the seat of honor, fully understood what. 2 weeks ago, Nestor continued, I was standing in the lobby of this company, in an old jacket, the way I sometimes do, because it is the only way an owner ever sees the truth. And a man threw his coffee at me, called me a loiterer, told me to fetch and to clean it up, and walked away without once looking at my face. 500 people went utterly still. He did not know who I was. And that, Nestor said quietly, is exactly the point. Because he was not cruel to me despite thinking I was no one. He was cruel to me because he thought I was no one. And a man who is cruel to those he thinks are powerless has told you everything you will ever need to know about how he will treat your company, your workers, and your legacy the moment he thinks no one is watching. He turned then and looked directly at Brandon Reeve, and for the first time all night his voice carried an edge. I have spent the last 2 weeks watching Mr. Reeve. I know about Maria's pension. I know about the Christmas bonus. I know about the fear you built where my family used to be. And I know, and here the room felt the ground shift, about the sale. The one you thought I was too broken to notice. The one that would have carved up 40 years of these people's lives so that you and your friends could cash out. I know all of it. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, your authority in this company is terminated. Your golden parachute is void under the cause provisions of a contract I personally signed, and the sale is dead. I killed it this afternoon, with the same signature, Nestor said, that used to sign your paychecks. The ballroom did not applaud. Not yet. It was too stunned. Brandon Reeve sat frozen in the seat of honor, ruined in front of 500 people and the press, the coronation he had planned. turned into the most public dismantling of a career anyone in that room would ever witness. He opened his mouth. There was nothing to say. There is never anything to say, in that moment, for a man who built his whole life on a contempt that has finally, catastrophically, met the one person it should have feared. He stood, at last, and walked out through 500 silent people, and not one of them stopped him, and not one of them, this time, was on his side. The board members were in that room, and they had their own reckoning coming, though Nestor was merciful with the ones who deserved mercy. Some of them had been complicit with Brandon, seduced by the numbers and the promised payout of the sale, and those ones Nestor dealt with in the weeks that followed, quietly and completely, because a house is not safe while the people who let the wolf in still hold the keys. But most of them had simply been asleep, the way boards are asleep, trusting the polished man with the good job because trusting him was easier than the work of looking closely. And to them Nestor said, in a private meeting the next morning that several of them described later as the most frightening 90 minutes of their careers, a single thing: I stepped back because I was grieving, and I trusted you to watch my house. You did not watch it. A stranger in a gray jacket saw in 2 weeks what you did not see in 6 years, because you never took your own jackets off. That ends today. Every one of you is going to learn the name of every person who cleans this building. I'll be checking. And they did. God help them, they did, because they had all just watched what happened to a man who thought the founder wasn't paying attention. But the deeper reckoning was not about the board, or even about Brandon. It was about the thing Nestor had let happen by leaving. He had learned something in those 2 weeks in the gray jacket that no amount of ownership had taught him. That you cannot build a thing on a soul and then guard the soul from a distance, through quarterly reports and a signature. A soul has to be tended in person, by someone who walks the floors and knows the names, or it dies while the numbers still look fine, which is the most dangerous way for a thing to die, because no one notices until it's gone. Brandon Reeve had not been an aberration. Brandon Reeve had been what always, inevitably fills the space when the person who cares steps away and hands the keys to a person who only knows how to extract. The failure, Nestor understood, had been his own, the failure of absence. And he would spend the rest of his life correcting it, not with anger, but with presence. So he stood on that stage, in front of 500 people who had just watched a titan fall. And he made a choice about what kind of night this was going to be. He could have let it be a night about Brandon Reeve, about vengeance, about the satisfying spectacle of a cruel man destroyed. And part of the room, the part that loves a downfall, was ready for that. But Nestor Salazar was 61 years old and had buried the love of his life and had clawed his way up from a produce truck. And he knew something about what actually matters that the young and the vengeful have not yet learned. That tearing down a bad man is easy and hollow, and that the only thing that ever really lasts is what you build in his place. And then Nestor Salazar did the thing that turned a night of ruin into a night people would tell their grandchildren about. He did not dwell on Brandon. He turned back to the room, and his voice warmed, and he said, "But I did not come here tonight to destroy a man. I came here to remember who we are." And he called them up, one by one. He called up Walter, the guard who had worked the lobby for 30 years and been looked through for 2. And he told the room Walter's name and his children's names, because Nestor had made it his business to know them. And he announced that Walter would be retiring the next month with a full pension and a bonus for 30 years of watching the door of a house that had forgotten him. He called up Maria and told the room what had been done to her and what had been undone. And then he called up Carmen. Carmen came to the stage terrified, 24 years old, 3 months into her first job, with no idea why she was there. And Nestor Salazar took her hand, and he turned to the 500 people, and he told them the story. The old man on his knees in the lobby, the coffee, and the young woman who had everything to lose and had crouched down anyway, to help a stranger she thought was no one, because it was the right thing. And there was no one important watching. "This," Nestor said, holding up Carmen's hand while she trembled and the tears started down her face. "This is the company I built. Not him. Her. She could do nothing for me. She thought I was nobody, and she helped me anyway. He looked at the room. You want to know who to promote, in any company, in any life. It is never the one who is kind to the powerful. It is always the one who is kind to the person who can't do anything for them. And he announced, to a room now finally, thunderously on its feet, that Carmen was being moved into a leadership development program that reported directly to the founder's office, because Nestor Salazar had spent 40 years looking for people like her, and was not about to let this one be ground down by anyone. Gala became legend. The story of it traveled, the way true stories do, far beyond that ballroom, into other companies, other boardrooms. A quiet warning passed between the kind of people who understand what it means. Somewhere out there, right now, is a CEO being a little kinder to the maintenance man than he otherwise would be, because he heard about a founder in a gray jacket and a cup of coffee, and it put a small useful fear in him. That was Nestor's real victory, not Brandon's ruin. The fear he planted in every Brandon Reeve who heard the story, and the hope he planted in every Carmen. Nestor Salazar came back to run his company after that night. The grief did not leave him, but the purpose did return, because he understood now that stepping back had been a mistake, that a thing built on a soul cannot be guarded from a distance, that someone has to stay and tend it. He restored the bonus. He brought back the ones who could be brought back. He built Brandon Reeve's crime into a permanent lesson, a program, named for Elena, that trained and promoted people precisely on the basis of how they treated those who could do nothing for them. And he kept walking his lobbies in the gray jacket until the day he died, an old man that new employees sometimes mistook for a maintenance man. And the ones who were kind to him never knew how closely they were being watched or how much it would come to matter. Carmen rose. Of course she did. Years later she ran a division, and then more than a division, and she was known throughout the company as the fairest, most feared, most beloved leader it had, because she had learned the founder's lesson at its source, on her knees, on a marble floor, and she never once forgot it. She had a saying she used when she interviewed people for important jobs, a thing she would do that confused the candidates and revealed everything. She would walk them through the lobby, and she would watch, not how they spoke to her, but how they spoke to the guard at the door, the person clearing the tables, the man who held the elevator. And afterward, the ones who asked why she hired, whom she hired, she would tell the story of an old man and a cup of coffee, and then she would say the thing Nestor Salazar had said to her, the thing his father had said to him, the thing that had built an empire and outlasted a predator, and would, she hoped, outlast her too. You learn everything about a man, she would say, by how he treats someone who can't do anything for him. Everything. It is the only test that has never once been wrong. If this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting on your screen right now. A professor who mocked a Latino man's accent in front of 400 students, and whose own words got him fired by Monday. Watch it next. And wherever you are tonight, remember, the person you look through might be the person who signs your paycheck. But that's not the real lesson. The real lesson is simpler and older, and it costs you nothing to live by. Be kind to the invisible people, not because of who they might turn out to be, because of who it makes you.